We're back. Hello. So, I'm enjoying doing these episodes. So today, I'm doing another history episode. And since today should be September, let's honor it with its unofficial name. And its unofficial day today would be National Bourbon Day. So, of course, we are going to learn a little bit about bourbon. Roll credits. Quick little history we're going to do today about bourbon. Not too much, I'm not too into it, because bourbon is a really giant staple of the American spirit. It is one of our pride and joys of the American spirit. It is the only one that we can call a bourbon if it's made in America, and there's plenty of rules for that. But let's go back a little bit, back to the 1700s. 1700s, the settlers came over to the colonies, colonized it, and then finally made their way across the Appalachian Mountains, which they settled in the areas that is now known as Virginia, Kentucky, and Carolinas. These areas were notoriously known for the woods, the streams, the constant climate change, which is ideal areas to just start doing stuff like this, to start growing crops. It's perfect, ideal, great area. So once everything got settled down, it was around the 1770s. There's a big strain happening, which of course was the Revolutionary War. One of the main issues of that was the taxation without representation. Now, we're not getting into the whole social study, the whole aspect. Let's just get into the simple, neat ingredient of it. The Britons started taxing out the malt and barley, and so it made it more difficult for them to make certain things like beer and stuff that they enjoyed. So they were forced to start using stuff that was around them at the time. And one of the biggest commodity that was native to their land was corn. Corn being the #1 main ingredient in bourbon. So they started making these corns, they started distilling it, and they first got introduced to the #1 great corn whiskey. Corn whiskey was born and raised and introduced in Kentucky, and that was the #1 commodity at the time. Now, they weren't fucking selling it yet. Making corn whiskey was made in a 10-gallon copper jug, and it was pretty much personal consumption. And it was actually considered a chore. Making whiskey was a chore. And it was just a day in the life. Nothing crazy came out of it. Flash forward a little bit more, past the wars, past everything else. 19th century. The 19th century gave birth to something that revolutionized everything, especially in Kentucky. The steam. Steamboat, steam products, and steam technology changed everything. And Louisville, Kentucky was the epicenter of it all because of the stream that was surrounding it. Everything was quick travel, quick, easy. And a great man named Ennis Coffey, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Ennis Coffey, he produced and introduced the idea of distillery. He pretty much can argue to be the father of distillery. He pretty much created a continuous still, which made making whiskey faster, cheaper, and efficient. When you had the rivers on the streams, it was easier to transport to cities and location, selling whiskey. But yet, we still not have gotten to the beloved bourbon. That's just the mass production, the idea of creating mass production whiskey. Flashing forward, the key honor of getting the father of bourbon, in my opinion, and people argue it so a lot, is a man named Dr. James Crowe, a chemist. He pretty much perfected the formula of creating bourbon by using none other than science.
Yes, science!
Without getting into too much detail, because it's way beyond my knowledge and skills, he pretty much mastered the whole art of the fermentation, the heat reductions, and what's needed to yield all this mash mess. But that's not all. A young woman named Catherine Spears helped the other half. So she could arguably be the mother of bourbon. She figured out that putting sour mash in oak barrels, aging it, makes the whiskey non-toxic and actually makes it taste sweeter and better. So you put these two together, and then you have, all together now, bourbon! Bourbon was created by two people who just made a love child together. The idea of putting stuff in oak barrels, well, not oak barrels, but barrels in general, is old as time. It's been done for centuries. The Greeks used to do it for their wines. Mexicans used to do it for tequila. Everything that's been done for years. So the idea of just putting that is just another process on it. Now here's a real tricky urban legend of it all: the name bourbon. There is no cemented place or time where the name actually come from. There's two largely big rumors of it. One of them being that bourbon was called based around the area and region that it was birthplace at, which is Louisville, Kentucky, of the area of Bourbon County. Now, the problem with that would be that Bourbon County was not called Bourbon County in the 1870s, so the timeline doesn't actually add up. But that's the belief you want to believe in, then go ahead. The other story would be done, this is the more funny, fascinating one, which is two Frenchmen used to smuggle up and down the Ohio River. And they'll pick up these whiskeys from Kentucky, steamboat all the way down to Louisiana, and resell it purposely. And they'll age their products in cognac barrels. And they'll sell it on a corner of Bourbon Street. So, because there was no official name of their product, everyone nicknamed their whiskey Bourbon Whiskey. And that's how bourbon got their name. Now, again, these two things, not actual fact, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter! Whenever religion becomes fact,
print the legend.
If you want, whichever decision you want to make, I'm more fascinated about the two Frenchmen personally because that is such a cool little stories. But you choose what you want to believe. Now, let's held back a little bit, flashing forward. 20th century came around, and well, it wasn't all great. During the 1920s, Prohibition happened. Now, we talked about Prohibition in the IPA episode, but Prohibition really put a dent on everything. It outlawed making bourbon in general. No one was allowed to make any type of bourbon in mass production at all. So it forced people to start making moonshine. It forced people to start doing bathtub gins. It forced people to start relying on the Canadians, and that's where Canadian whiskey became so popular. They pretty much kept afloat everything. And Canadian whiskey was notoriously linked to organized crime. And so, around 1930s, bourbon at this time was damn near gone. It was out. The president finally lifted the Prohibition Act, and so people started making bourbon again. But it wasn't making no sale because people don't know anything about it anymore. It's been 10 years. It's been a whole decade since people even touched it. So what they started doing was the propaganda route. And, luckily at this time, we were already going to war. We were in this giant global war that was taking up the news and headways. And so the American companies decided to use this as an advantage, as a propaganda. They first started simulating that beer was unpatriotic because beer was linked to the Germans. And so drinking beer made you unpatriotic. It made you un-American by drinking beer. So what they started doing is, if you don't drink beer, drink bourbon. Bourbon is made here in America. It's 100% pure American bread. American as apple pie. It's pretty much this consumption of it all. And they went even one step further in putting small pints in the GI's MREs when they went out to war. So the GI became this national ambassador to the global world and helped introduce the world to bourbon. And that's pretty much how that's happened. And the idea kept afloat, and it worked. For the 40s and 50s, bourbon was a big deal, but wasn't what it is now. Flash forward again. Bourbon hit another slumps in the 70s, during the baby boom eras, 60s and 70s, to rebel against their parents and the idea that they had. They refused to drink anything that their parents drank. Bourbon was a big aspect of that. So no bourbon. They went back to wine and beer. Anything to go against the grain.
Fucking hippies.
Around the 1980s, though, the 1980s was interesting because bourbon hit another peak, but from an odd place. Japan. For some weird reason, and I couldn't really find a detail of it, but for some reason, Japan fell in love with whiskey and started importing these whiskeys from all over the place, all over, and bourbon was one of their main favorite ones. So bourbon became this nice steady area place between the 80s and 90s. It was a flow. It wasn't popular. It wasn't huge. Around 1999, they officially made Kentucky the birthplace of bourbon and officially named September National Bourbon Day. But that's not where everything started for them. Because bourbon, the renaissance of bourbon, is actually very recent. It's not that old. You can attribute that to something special. Around 2007, there was a little show called, on a little small channel called AMC. And AMC showed this show that's set in the time frame of the greatest generations, the 40s and 50s. And it showed a guy who was a womanizer, who was a man's man, smoked cigarettes, cussed, got shit done, and smoked bourbon every fucking episode.
Right, okay with you?
That show, my friend, was called Mad Men. And so 2007, Mad Men was introduced. And Mad Men made drinking bourbon look cool, made drinking old-fashioned look cool. And everybody wanted to be Don Draper. Everybody wanted to be this man. Everybody wanted to be the signification of cool. So thanks for that, bourbon shot up. And everything shot up, especially the bourbon that he drank on that show shot up. And that's how the price ranges of it. Because before that, aged bourbon was really a thing. Before that, bourbon was considered like a hick spirit. It was for the hick poor people. Jim Beam was considered a poor drink. And so things changed drastically. Now you see like these certain things that change a lot, and it's a fascinating thing. So from 2007 and on, it just bourbon became this giant industry and became more popular. It's getting more popular as the day goes on, because now the way they're doing bourbon is they're aging it certainly like how they used to do wine and old cognac back in the days. There's certain limited releases, certain things are aged differently, and it's a fascinating world. It's an addicting world, as you can tell, and that's pretty much the history of bourbon at that point. What exactly is a bourbon? So bourbon has some real key, strict rules, but it's extremely simple. So there's only 5 rules you have to follow to be called yourself a bourbon. And it's extremely strict, but it has to be hereby, and it's followed very to the T.
Rule number 1.
Despite popular belief, it does not have to be made in Kentucky. It just has to be made in the United States of America. That's number 1 first rule. It has to be an American-made product.
Rule number 2.
It has to be at least, by minimum, 51% corn. Everything else, the rye, the mash, barley, everything can be added, but it's reduced. It has to be at least 51% corn. So the majority of your spirit has to be corn.
Rule number 3.
And that's another important one. It has to be aged in brand new chark oak barrels. Brand new. It can't be happening to be used before. It has to be brand new. It has to stay in. There is no, despite belief, there really is no minimum age, except if you want to be called a straight bourbon. To be called a straight bourbon, you have to be aged at least for 2 years. Other than that, it can be aged as much as you want, just as long as it's inside of an oak barrel.
Alright, well, let's screw that one up. Let's do a quick editorial here. For rule number 4, it is whenever the bourbon is introduced inside of a barrel, it has to be at maximum no over than 125 proof. And whenever it's done and it gets bottled, it has to be at least over 80% proof. So those are real margins there. I know, I am a fool. Well, back to the show.
Number 5. Nothing can touch the bourbon unless it's water. And the only reason you put in water is to dilute the proof to lower it down. Other than that, it has to be what it is inside, all natural, not to be messed or meddled with. Again, there's a lot of loopholes around this, but those are the 5 simple, strong rules about it. Other than that, we got whiskey, flavored whiskey, rye whiskey, all of that. To be a bourbon is very specific in his own right, just like tequila and just like cognac. It's very extremely specific to the region and to the rule that it has adhered by, and those are just great. And right now I have my top 4 favorite at the moment. 2 regional and local. This one's local to the area, and this one's more of a nationwide thing. The walking stick. Walking stick is a single barrel, 90 proof, 40% alcohol by volume, and this one is, I think, made. Oh, this was made out of Louisville, Kentucky. That is a good fucking shit. A little pricey. A range about, let me say, $50, but that will put you on some heat on shit. This one is my favorite one. It's a cute little distillery out of South Carolina. Coosa Cut from Rotten Little Bastard. I got this actually. Got the chance to bottle this myself, so it was fun going there. And again, this one is 96% proof. Is really smooth. I think this is one really underrated. I really have high hopes for the distillery. They really got something going on special over there. And then these two here are extremely local to my region. This one is Bourbon French Oak Bourbon, 46%, 92% proof, 92 proof by volume. This was a 72% corn. So this one's really good, and the A is different. And then also they got the Whitmire Single Barrel Cask Blue Label. And before I forget, just $20. I'm gonna hold it and hype that up right there. Buffalo Trace. You can never fucking go wrong with Buffalo Trace. I really wish their other products were easier to find. This one is starting to go down that route of being difficult to find because people are assholes and like hoarding shit. But Buffalo Trace is the company that created Blanton's and Eagle Rare and Pappy's, but they finally made their own. Well, not they made their own, but they finally made like a more their name brand of their distillery, and it's becoming one of those things again when it's super hard to find. $25, and then it's super rare to find because people are starting to hoard these motherfucking things. But it's a great fucking whiskey, especially if you're on a budget. You can't go wrong with it.
Damn good stuff, son.
I'm telling you guys, bourbon is one of those rare spirits that anybody can really get into it, because there is a certain science behind it as well, to drinking it, which I will probably do. That's a whole episode in itself on how to drink certain bourbons and certain scotch and stuff like that. I would have to do more research because, like I said, that's his own fucking episode, and I want to dedicate that entirely to that. So, but that'll probably be my next step up. But until then, I hope you learned something new today from
Knowing is half the battle.
So until next time, my friends, drink safe, drink smart, drink responsibly. Salud.